Tunize, Tsakeze, Skyze, Simgiget, Sigidem Hanak, Kankubawilstuk. My name is Kai Nagata from the Nagata family in the Kispiox Valley. And we are uninvited guests on the territory of Wilpsdelgamuch. And yet we've encountered nothing but generosity from our neighbors, especially the Giksan and Wet'suwet'en families, since we came here. And so we feel no choice but to help however we can when the chiefs and the house groups ask for that support. So I'm here on behalf of my family, but I'm also here on behalf of my organization, Dogwood, which is happy to support this wonderful gathering for the third year in a row. I have asked some dear friends and collaborators to help explore the topic of counterinsurgency and the tactics that have been used to undermine indigenous governments, not just here, but around the world. But before they come up, I'm going to show a few slides just to lay some context out for all of you based on some research that we've been doing out on the territories and with allies across the continent. So if we can dim the lights, what I'll do is just run you through a little bit of the background that we've been able to put together on this topic. Can we dim the lights in the front of the room here? So I want to talk today about the owner of the Coastal GasLink pipeline, a private equity fund called KKR in New York, Coastal GasLink, and the role of General David Petraeus. First, to familiarize you with KKR, Kohlberg, Kravis, Roberts and Company is a huge private equity firm in New York. They buy companies in different sectors of the economy, and now they have $500 billion in assets under management, $500 billion. The large majority of their energy portfolio is in fossil fuels, primarily in gas. And KKR, along with AIMCO, owns 65% of the Coastal GasLink pipeline, a majority stake. And recently, they just picked up a large stake in Pembina Pipeline Corporation, which means they are the Haisla Nation's partner on the Cedar LNG terminal as well. Here's Coastal GasLink listed in their portfolio of companies on their website, just above the Colonial Pipeline Company in the United States. So I want to tell you about the KKR Global Institute. 10 years ago, KKR hired David Petraeus, a retired US Army general and former CIA director, and he created the firm's internal CIA, which he calls the KKR Global Institute, or KGI. KGI identifies risks and then works with portfolio companies to neutralize those risks. He has run KGI for the last 10 years and is now a partner at KKR, sharing in the enormous wealth that that company has created. David Petraeus was the top US commander in Iraq and later commanded all allied NATO forces in Afghanistan. And he wrote the field manual now used by the US Army and the Marine Corps in countering insurgencies. He was appointed by President Obama as the director of the CIA in 2011, and he ran the Central Intelligence Agency for just over 1 year before a sex scandal destroyed his government career. Petraeus had an affair with his biographer, Paula Broadwell, and the FBI found that Petraeus had illegally shared classified information with Broadwell. She is a former military intelligence officer who specializes in counterterrorism, and he was passing her classified documents. When that was discovered, he was forced to resign from the CIA. Nobody heard from him for 5 months, and he reemerged with an op-ed in the Washington Post called A New American Renaissance. And the #1 reason he listed for the US to be optimistic about the next 100 years is, he said, we are the world's largest producer of natural gas with a 100-year supply. So why is a US Army general and CIA director so focused on oil and gas resources, specifically fracking in North America? I find this quote revealing. He said, we could have bought all the oil in the region for 100 years for what we've spent in Iraq. He was talking to the president of Kazakhstan in his capacity as a general in 2009. And they were worried about why the US Army wanted to show up in Kazakhstan. And he said, don't worry, we're not here for the oil. We could have bought all the oil in the region for what we spent in Iraq. And what I read into that comment is that Petraeus saw firsthand how much blood and treasure the US spilled to control oil and gas resources in the Middle East. And he realized that the technology of fracking changed that equation, because by fracking indigenous lands in Canada, the US, and Mexico, American companies could once again dominate the global fossil fuel sector. This article in the Washington Post was really his job wanted ad. He laid out a vision of a fracking-powered juggernaut that could outcompete China or Europe. And the next month, he was hired on Wall Street at the notorious private equity firm KKR. And at the time, he told a journalist that his new job is like being director of the CIA for a global financial firm. Again, we have to ask why. Why does an investment firm need its own CIA? What kind of work would require a 4-star general? He explained this year what his role is. He says, I identify ways to reduce risks so that we have the confidence to make investments. Once we've made investments, we help the companies that we own as they run into problems. And it's surprising, actually, how much you can help them with just sheer determination, boots on the ground, working with host nation leaders. This is a podcast earlier this year, and he still talks like a military commander. On the right is the cover of the book that he wrote on countering insurgencies, his field manual for counterinsurgency warfare. It was commissioned and edited by David Petraeus, and we have pulled out a few key elements from his strategy that I think are relevant to our discussion about the private sector trying to build pipelines through indigenous lands. And those 4 concepts are reconciliation, legal preparation of the battlefield, kinetic operations, and withdrawal. So the first concept is reconciliation. This is the word that David Petraeus uses for paying tribal leaders to support a foreign military invasion. One of his most famous quotes in Iraq is, "Money is ammunition." In other words, bullets and money are interchangeable in achieving certain strategic goals. And what he did was use the unlimited funds of the US war machine to simply pay local tribes not to shoot at Americans, or even better, to shoot at each other. The field manual says, without support from the various power brokers in an area of operations, military action is unlikely to gain support from the local population. This means find out who the local sheikhs are, or the local chiefs, and buy them off. And as we know, money has been a major factor in maintaining support for the Coastal GasLink pipeline. And even before KKR bought Coastal GasLink, TC Energy and the BC government spent millions of dollars to deepen divides within indigenous communities. Coastal GasLink likes to say, every chance they get, we have agreements in place with 20 band councils along the pipeline route. And that means they get training and jobs, cash payments over the life of the project. However, one leaked contract in one community showed that bands are required to dissuade their own members from opposing the project or even criticizing Coastal GasLink on social media. And when band members in that community found out about the terms of the contract, they voted no. 70% of them voted no. And the band chief went ahead and signed anyway. Money is ammunition. The second concept is legal preparation of the battlefield, because some people cannot be bought off. And Petraeus calls tribal leaders who won't take money to support an invasion irreconcilables. And so the next step is to lay the legal groundwork for violence. The field manual says, build trust and legitimacy by helping locals and the media understand the rules that US forces follow and the safeguards they apply in operations. Legal preparation of the battlefield can also help delegitimize the insurgents, as locals and the media will better understand the insurgents' violation of the laws. This will sound familiar to anybody who's dealt with injunctions. Coastal GasLink's most powerful tool in forcing this pipeline through is a court injunction. That means a company files a civil lawsuit against Jane and John Doe, and then they can apply for a court injunction to prevent those people from impeding work on that project. And in Canada, research from Yellowhead Institute shows that corporations succeed 76% of the time in obtaining injunctions against Indigenous people, but judges give Indigenous plaintiffs injunctions against corporations only 19% of the time. It's a completely rigged game. And if people refuse to recognize an injunction, they become targets for both police and private security. Late Art Manuel called this the legal billy club, the tool for clearing people off of their own land. And I want to make the point about intelligence gathering on the territories because it's something that we have witnessed shift over the last few years. Most surveillance and most evidence gathering is not conducted by the RCMP. Security contractors, most of them ex-police or ex-military, are the main force on Wet'suwet'en territory. This individual told me that he was a British Royal Marine in Northern Ireland. That is a counterinsurgency war. And these Coastal GasLink operatives, we have witnessed summon RCMP officers by radio and at times appear to direct police actions. And that is core to the allegations contained in the lawsuit by the Giddimden clan against Forsyth Security and the RCMP. Just 2 days ago, on the bridge to the Unistoten Healing Center, as the rafts were coming in, I spoke to this individual. He is an active duty reservist in a Canadian infantry regiment, and his day job is pipeline security. Phase 3 is kinetic operations, because if reconciliation doesn't work, there's always the threat of violence. And I just want to give you a window into how Petraeus conducted himself when he was leading air assault troopers in Iraq. He said, I slammed my fist on the table and said, that's it, I will not renegotiate. And I was very clear about who the sheikh of the strongest tribe in northern Iraq was. And it was obviously the commander of the Screaming Eagles, 101st Airborne, which had some 250 helicopters, in addition to an infantry division's worth of air assault troopers. And that was him describing a meeting with tribal leaders in Mosul in 2003. He describes himself as the sheikh of the strongest tribe in northern Iraq. But the US had a problem in that war. Too many soldiers coming home in coffins. And Petraeus knew that US troops dying in Iraq was creating political backlash at home. And he also knew that atrocities committed by US troops and military contractors were actually fueling the insurgency. And so they needed a new strategy, which was to make Iraqis do the fighting. And it was the same strategy they later used in Afghanistan. Here he says, we're very much on target with the growth of the Afghan army and the Afghan police. They trained 300,000 police and military personnel in Afghanistan to fight the American war. The field manual says success is more likely if the host nation recruits local personnel for its remote area paramilitary. And there are numerous advantages to using local police for counterinsurgency operations because they know the area and they generally have more credibility in the community and in the media than a foreign army. But also, if they commit heinous acts against civilians, the occupiers have a shield of deniability. They can simply download that responsibility to the local force. And who is our local remote area paramilitary? It's the RCMP. Chief Superintendent John Brewer was, until very recently, the gold commander of the RCMP's controversial pipeline unit, KKR. But before that, in 2010, he was NATO's senior police advisor in Afghanistan, the top police trainer under General David Petraeus. Sergeant Kevin Bracewell is the bronze commander in charge of the tactical troop that actually makes arrests, that puts hands on people. Bracewell is a former tank commander in the British Army and also trained police in Afghanistan in 2011 under Petraeus. I don't know if Superintendent Brewer has ever stood at this podium, but we know that his silver commanders and his bronze commanders have, because this is the room where they stage the raids. this hotel room in Smithers. These are members, when I say policemen, these are the Afghan National Police that are trained by US and Canadian forces in counterinsurgency operations. They might look familiar because these are the RCMP officers on one of their winter raids on Wet'suwet'en territory. And the idea that I would present to you is that the RCMP are not actually the masterminds of this operation, that instead they're playing the same role as the Afghan police, putting a local face on an international campaign. And speaking of winter, why do they always raid in winter? Well, you look it up in the field manual. Extreme conditions, such as in nations and higher elevations, can make insurgent movements difficult in winter. They encourage officers to factor weather into their, quote, intelligence preparation of the battle space. And that reminds me of the day that the floods knocked out all of those highways down south, and they had dozens of RCMP officers on a private jet flying up here to raid. The last phase is withdrawal, because the theory behind all counterinsurgencies is that eventually the occupying army meets its objectives and just hands the war off to these newly trained local forces. But as we know, reality is a little bit more complicated. You might remember these scenes of chaos in Afghanistan 2 summers ago. The US fought there for 20 years. They spent $2 trillion. They trained 300,000 police and soldiers, and the Taliban took over in a matter of days. And this is part of Petraeus' legacy. But this is also his legacy. KKR has a dark and troubling legacy, and the companies that they own are responsible for a long list of pipeline spills, deadly explosions, methane leaks, toxic waste spills, and clashes with indigenous communities. And as we wrap up, I just want to share one case study from a subsidiary in Mexico that was trying to build a project called the Sonora Pipeline. So in 2023, a KKR company received a permit to build a gas pipeline across Yaqui territory in Mexico. That's the Rio Yaqui, that's the river that is the water source for all the 8 Yaqui communities. 7 of those towns signed on, but the last community, Loma de Bacum, refused. And I'll quote a local land defender, Fidencio Aldama, who said, "Our ancestors taught us to respect our roots, culture, traditions, and customs, but the white man, those allied with money, have intervened, producing division in our communities." In August 2016, there was a horrible clash. Violence broke out in Loma de Bacum as men from other Yaqui villages drove into town to confront land defenders who had set up a blockade. But observers who were there that day say that there were private security contractors mixed into the crowd. Fistfights broke out, and suddenly several vehicles went up in flames. Mexican state police swept into town in armored vehicles, and this is how they're dressed. And a man was shot and killed. So police arrested Fidencio Aldama, the land defender that I quoted, and he was carrying a gun that day. He was carrying a .45 caliber pistol, but the autopsy on the man who died showed that he was killed by a 5.56 millimeter round. Where is that community today? Since that clash in 2016, according to Mexican news reports that we've been able to access, at least 15 residents of the village have been kidnapped and disappeared. 5 of those people were found in a mass grave. Another environmental activist from a neighboring village was found dead in a ditch. And Fidencio Aldama is serving a 15-year prison sentence for a murder that he did not commit. And from prison he wrote, "I carry in my blood, flesh, and skin this grand history of the Yaqui Nation, which has for centuries struggled against extermination, violence, and territorial dispossession. We must continue existing with self-determination and autonomy to decide the manner we want to organize ourselves in our territory and the form in which we want to construct our future." And after he was arrested, community members dug up a 25-foot section of the pipeline. And 6 years later, it's still not repaired because the Yaqui continue their legal battle against the Sonora pipeline. So what is the role of one man in all of this? It's true that David Petraeus has done more than any person alive to bake this counterinsurgency doctrine into the operations of the US military and its allies in Canada. And during the same time frame, those weapons and tactics and mindset have come home to North America, most obviously in our police departments. In the last 10 years, Petraeus has also transferred those ideas to the private sector, specifically the oil and gas industry, through his leadership role at KKR. But this interplay between colonial military campaigns, police, and private companies has been going on for a long, long time. Canada has been doing it for 150 years. And here on Wet'suwet'en territory, the counterinsurgency has been very intense since KKR announced that it was buying the pipeline at the end of 2019. But the manufactured division, the police violence, the media manipulation, all of that was happening before then. This playbook is 150 years old. So we shouldn't overstate the role of one man. And despite his power and capacity for violence, I don't think it's productive to be afraid of him. Because there's a lot of things that KKR can't control, like natural forces. This is a pipeline work site in the Gosnell wetlands that was flooded by the spring thaw, totally shutting down construction in May. And Coastal GasLink has now racked up over $8 billion in cost overruns and a hell of a lot more in legal liability through the damage that they've done to unceded Wet'suwet'en territories, culture, and people. And they're starting to face some backlash. KKR has lost battles against the workers at companies they've bought out and driven into bankruptcy, like Toys R Us. And their toxic brand is starting to rub off on the cultural institutions that legitimize them, like Claremont College, like the Museum of Modern Art in New York. So I want to give a shout out to the art lovers in New York who crashed Marie-Josée Kravis's garden party recently. And they're doing all of these leveraged buyouts of companies with other people's money, specifically banks and pension funds. And those are real people's retirement dollars. So maybe those unions, like public school teachers, should ask why they're funding an American general to use military tactics against indigenous people in places like Mexico and right here in Canada. And we should ask why people are still giving their mortgage payments to banks like RBC, which they're using to fund this violence. I have a quote here from Namox. He says, "Although KKR may deploy CIA tactics on our lands and to our people, they will never succeed with their project. We see more value in our lands, waters, and freedoms than what any amount of their money would ever be worth." And what gives me hope is that David Petraeus and KKR are completely baffled by people who can't be bought off by money. It does not compute. People like Gwinnett, like Yagalar, like Was, like Namox. These guys in New York, they don't understand a world where things are more valuable than money. And we're in one of the last places in the world where that still exists. And the reason that we have things like salmon is because of the uninterrupted line, the unbroken generations of leaders who've taken care of these rivers from the headwaters all the way down to the coast. So that's what I have for you today, and I want to bring up some of the people who have lived through this in person to talk about how they've seen these tactics on the territories, but also their thoughts about how we might respond. And throughout the day, we'll have other opportunities for responses in the room from others who may want to share their thoughts as well. But I'm hoping that we can bring up Denise Namox, Gayleen Morris, Colin Sutherland Wilson, and our friend Miriam Adrangi to talk about the research that we've been able to put together and maybe where we go next. Can we bring the lights at the front up and we'll turn the video lights back on? So I want to hand it over to Namox first, just for your response to the information that we've been able to put together.
We do so much work in outreach. We talk to people that have been doing these studies for years. And in what we found in just the last few months shocked even them. Our friends from Amnesty are in this room. They've studied David Petraeus for years, and they were unaware of how deep this went. When we try to tell people the truth of what David Petraeus is, where he comes from, his history, it's like a Tom Clancy movie. This is unbelievable. It doesn't happen. Not in Canada. And yet it does every day. When we try to tell people the enormity of a violence, psychological, physical, spiritual, that our people endure. And now it's normal because people such as David Petraeus, corporations such as KKR, governments such as the federal and provincial governments of this country say it's okay to treat us less than human. To say that that guidebook written by a warmonger is normal to apply to Indigenous people of this country. That's where you make the difference. We say it, and we'll say it over and over again. If you're silent, you're approving it. If you're sitting still, you're supporting it. So that's where you need to speak and speak the truth. You need to stand up together. Our friend Guji always says to us, people ask us, how can we help? Get off your goddamn asses is how you can help, and that's exactly what he said. I love Shannon because she loves one of my quotes. And the quote is, those billionaires are so poor, all they have is money. That's all they have. Look what you have. When they bring this violence to us and they think that we in particular are going to run, you've heard Walat, you've heard Was, you've heard Yagalao. We're not afraid. How could we be afraid? If we're afraid, and even the thought of being afraid, they won. To me, they've lost. They lost when they even thought of this project to kill these beautiful rivers, go through the mountains to get to the coast. Everything is financed. They don't even have a market. Do you know if they sell this gas that Canada has to subsidize it just for them to operate? And yet they're willing to spend billions of dollars to do that. When we take on, and this is only an owner of a part owner, yes, it's a majority, $500 billion, $500 billion. You know what a trillion is? That's 1,000 billion. You know what a billion is? That's 1,000 million. Now, if you put that in the context, it actually could scare a lot of people. It gives me confidence. It shows how afraid they are of the Wet'suwet'en. They show me how afraid they are of the Gitxsan. And number one, they know that the future is in our hands and we will look after it. They keep coming at us with guns. They keep coming at us with snakes. June 5th of this year, we're in Saskatoon, Royal Bank of Canada, shareholders meeting. They laid hands on me in my regalia. Auntie Janet, they laid hands on her. Then they segregated us. We had proxies to be there. Everything was done. They put us in a separate room. We couldn't even look at humans. We got a screen on TV to stare at. That was it. And then they said, we did our best to accommodate you. So yes, we were there. We made our speeches inside. We talked to a wall. Meanwhile, the humans were in the other room because we're not human according to them. Then we go outside to talk to our supporters. It's 20 below and cold. We're from the north. We're used to it, but we were cold there. But our supporters stayed out there for hours waiting for us. We stepped outside and we looked up, and the first thing we seen was snipers on top of the hotel rooms. We had to deal with our allies for months for the trauma that they went through for having those snipers there. And yet we deal with this all the time. We tell our cousins of the Gitxsan, we do this because you're next. We're the template. 2017 when, well, it was Kurg, they're actually going to change their name to CRU, Critical Response Unit. It was initially Community Industry Response Group. So they've removed community from it. They certainly haven't removed industry. If community is removed, which is the human part, it's only industry. You've taken that humanity away. We've already won because you're here. We've already won because we know what our elders have taught us. We've already won because we have people from other countries coming here and writing a book that the playbook from day one was used on us, and we're still here. I'd like to pass it on to Gayleen because she has endured much more than I have. But you know, as name carriers, as leaders, we lead from the front. That general leads from the back. He's ordering people to die. We don't. Gayleen, if I could, please. Miss I. Your interaction.
Hello, everybody. You guys have to excuse my voice. I was trying to get out of talking today. Thank you, everybody, for being here. One of the things that I was asked to speak on was the experiences that that I've had while I was out, not only in the territory, but even within community. I was invited out to Gidim Den territory by my cousin and by WAS, and I was out there for a little bit of time, and the experience out there is quite intense. It's, you know, for years and years watching the front lines and the things that had happened are one thing to see, you know, on social media or on TV. But when you're out there and you experience going up onto the territory right from, you know, the beginning of the Morris Service Road is intensity. It's not anything that anybody can ever really explain unless you've experienced it. And even taking a break and being away for some time and going back up to the territory, you still go into trauma mode. You still go into a mindset that you have to put up a protective shield over yourself to be able to make yourself go into what I've always called the war zone. You know, I think of the interactions that we've had with many people that have been able to go up and visit on Gidim Den territory, that have gone up onto Unistoten territory, and that would be the only way that I could explain it. And I started helping on the front line in March of, it was the early spring, and I didn't realize the intensity of it, and having RCMP members come. At first it was maybe 10 to 12 members, I think, in the morning and in the afternoon, and then they were coming and doing these walkthroughs, so they called it morning, noon, and in the evening. There were many supporters that were there that stood in support of Gidim Den. A lot of really solid, good people that were there, and they helped hold that front line down. And thinking of that experience, you know, it's around the clock. You're making breakfast, and you have RCMP not even caring that you've got a fence, like any person would have a fence in their front yard, and coming to your property and asking for permission to come through and ignoring that. And repeatedly doing it every day for, I think it was 3+ months. And then the intensity, it got more intense, and they were coming through the night. They were listening to your conversations in the trees. They were everywhere. And I think that these are important things to add to Slato's experience of what she and Shay and many of the Get 'em Den have experienced. Because these are real things that happen, and you look at the people that run these front lines, and you look at the everyday life that they need to manage their lives through, and they're the stories that they're not heard, because media will only spin a certain narrative of that story. And I suppress a lot of that stuff because it's easier to deal with. Moving forward to an event where I took my son to a training program in another province, and getting across the border, you would think jurisdiction-wise they shouldn't have any information about you, and I got stopped in another province in Alberta, and I got my car impounded for 30 days. The information was that there was a code 6 on my license. I have a full BC driver's license, and I was flagged in Alberta that I had a code 6. Now, code 6 is only that if once upon a time I lived in Alberta, and a code 6 would be that if I ever went back to that province and I wanted to hold a license in that province, I would need to take a driver's test. That is what a code 6 is. I haven't lived in Alberta for about 11 years, and you need to be in another province for 3 months before you could even get a license. Now, I was only planning to be there for 17 to 24 hours. I was taking my son to where he was going, and I was coming back. So I hadn't planned to be there for 3 months. And so I get stopped, and they identified me by name before I'd even given my license or my insurance. And that was a red flag for me. My son was recording, so it was all documented right from beginning to end. And those raised some real red flags for me, because you don't think that those lengths that the RCMP will go to, you don't realize how far they'll actually go to get, to share information with each other, but they do. And I remember one of the first people that I spoke to was Nemox, and it's a really vulnerable feeling to be in. It's to be in another place and not having your people around you to support you. It's a really vulnerable feeling, and luckily I had some really good supports that were able to help me through that. But that again re-traumatizes a person through how far the RCMP and industry will go to make sure that they immobilize you. I'm still to this day having to go to court. I have many trial dates ahead of me for that, and it's just it's something that many people in the front line have to deal with to present day. It's not just me, it's many people. And so I that's my experience, and I know that there are many other stories out there of frontline people that have experienced the same thing, and mine is just another chapter in this story of how the police, how industry and the RCMP, how KKR target Indigenous people that do the work for the safety of our people and our land and our water. And I think about that. I live an everyday life. I raise my kids. I do my own thing, and how that could be such a threat to industry is so mind-baffling to me. I've had many conversations with community members and asking them to come to our territory, and I can understand why they would be so afraid to want to come to our territory, because that narrative through the media is so bold that the RCMP those tactics of the RCMP frighten our people so much, and that's not right. That's not right, because our people, my grandparents, have brought us all out there as kids and have raised us in many different parts of the territory, and it's not right that our people feel so afraid to go up 44 kilometers on a service road for us to be able to go and enjoy our time out on our territory. So that's what I have to share. Thank you.
So my name is Hochki Colin Sutherland Wilson. I'm from Anspajach in the Giksan Nation. And as always, it's an honor to be here on Gidimt'en territory, and thank you, Was, for making us feel so welcome and so safe. So I think it's very important for the public, especially Canadians, to recognize what we're up against. Not only is it the public sector, but it's also the private sector. And everyone here has been subject to these so-called kinetic operations that were outlined in Petraeus' playbook. Now think about that. People living within this country being subject to kinetic operations designed by ex-CIA directors. And so what are our politicians doing about that? Where is the accountability? How come the RCMP can be trained and shaped in this way to serve the private sector, these pipeline companies, these private equity firms, to go out onto Indigenous lands and to subject us to all forms of violence, harassment, psychological torture? It's endless. It's entirely unethical. For myself, I've been a critic of Kohlberg for many years. You probably recognize me from my satirical role as the Gold Commander. But that was born out of conversations, at the railway blockade in New Hazelton. Because at every corner, every turn, we were seeing people denying accountability. We were looking at British Columbia's politicians, the provinces, denying any involvement with the RCMP operations. We were seeing a culture of secrecy. And now, when we look at all this evidence that has come to light, we see how blurred the lines are between the public sector and the private sector. And we're starting to get a glimpse of who might be really pulling the strings. Because our communities, and I say our communities too, because everyone here is my family. I grew up listening to stories of my great-grandfather, Wibiachim Samoygit, who fought in actual battles along with the Wet'suwet'en. He would sing war songs in the Wet'suwet'en language in front of my father when he was just a child in front of the potbelly stove. And so I grew up with that alliance firmly entrenched in my heart. And then also, we have 2 pipelines that have been proposed through the Giksan territory. And I know very well that we could be subject to this exact same playbook. Everything that we've been talking about could very well happen to us up north. So, when we look at what they've done to our communities, and I think especially the narratives that they've planted within our communities, when we look at the division We need to trace that division right back to its origin. These narratives are part of the playbook by KKR, by Coastal GasLink, by the perpetrators. And, you know, we've all heard what they've said about us time and time again, that they try to paint it as this is inherently our issues, our problems. Everything that we've seen so far, smearing our people in the media, that's a part of the groundwork, the prep work for the Kinetic operations. That's part of legitimizing the legal and public playing field. And so we really need to continue this research. We really need to detangle this mess. We need to see where all this violence is coming from. Because if we leave it at the status quo, you know, the public will still think, oh, this is a native problem. This is just dissidence. When in reality, we're standing on our values that we grew up with. We're standing on our laws, our governance, taking direction from those who came before us, who instructed us to caretake our lands so that we may thrive on them for many generations to come. So on one hand, we have to continue to reiterate that reality over and over and over in the face of this opposition by both the private and public sector. But also, we need to dismantle the web of lies that have been created by some of the most powerful players in the world. Oil and gas, ex-CIA, NATO operatives. We have some of the most trained, well-resourced entities that anyone on this planet could ever contend with, that are operating on these very lands. And so that's an important picture that really needs to be shared, because that's what we're up against as WILP, as people, as communities, as fathers, as mothers, as grandmothers and grandfathers, as family, because at the end of the day, we're here to live our lives in a way that we choose, because we have never given up that right. So thank you everybody for being here today and for looking at the facts that have been presented. And also, we need people to get out there, to start following these leads, to start dismantling the narratives, because that'll be a part of our healing journey. Because when they do this to our communities, it creates division, it creates hurt, it creates harm. And we really need to recognize, even amongst ourselves, that this was all imposed. This was a part of a plan. This was a part of a strategy in order to facilitate what is ultimately a profit-gaining venture. But at the end of the day, we are human, we are community, we love each other. And so, thank you everyone for your hard work, and let's continue to do this, and yeah, let's kick KKR's ass. Amia.
Hi everyone, my name's Miriam. I just want to begin by saying I'm so honored to be on this panel with such incredible folks who've had and who are sharing their stories and what they've been through. I think it's very grounding for us who aren't from this land. And I also want to thank so much the Gitxsan and Wet'suwet'en folks who've welcomed us to their territories over the past few days. I think it's such a beautiful area. The first time I was here was in 2010 when I went on to the Yinta, and the drastic way in which the police presence has changed has been just without words. Clearly, I can't even describe it. I think so. I do want to also. I'm going to draw attention to my scarf. I'm Iranian, and I actually, when I bought this scarf, it was to wear over my hair in Iran. And I might get emotional, but earlier, or I guess last year about this time, Iranian security police essentially began really just shooting at women who were taking their headscarves off. And just watching over social media, as it wasn't things that you were able to, and the news, I guess, it was really jarring to watch police shoot at people who looked exactly like you and, who literally my family left so that we could avoid these things. And it's really heartbreaking to know that to get away from these things, you have to leave your land and your culture and so much of that behind. But I think what's also important to mention about that is that when it comes to policing and shooting at, their neighbors, that's something that's associated with the places I'm from, the countries I'm from. And I think what I've noticed just over the years in different movements is that when it happens in Canada, the response is, how could that happen in Canada? And the reality is that people have been facing this for decades, basically since the RCMP existed. So for, what's it been now? The RCMP has existed over 150 years now. So for over 150 years, we've been hearing, how could this possibly happen in Canada when it's been happening for over 150 years? I think, especially mentioning KKR and the Community Industry Response Group, or the Critical Response Unit, which it may soon be called, we really need to recalibrate and be like, okay, well, if the RCMP has spent over 150 years branding themselves as these benevolent Mounties, really playing on this image of public safety and public security, and really creating a brand that's just so Canadiana, so nationalistic, that it's so important to really say, okay, this isn't just this benevolent Mountie that exists. I am an abolitionist, so I do come from that point of view, but I know that not everyone is. And so to take those folks who are looking at the RCMP as these bearers of public safety and really dismantle that image and to say, this isn't just that cop who is directing traffic over there. These are paramilitary forces. They're being trained by these people who are fabricating and manufacturing military tactics. That's what's happening here. And yes, it happens in Canada. It's been happening in Canada for so long. And given how many people are here, I do think this is a very important place to say, okay, we do have the power to rebrand this image. We are facing this brand that's existed for over 150 years. But we're also facing being on the right side of history, and we can expose this military operation. I think getting out the information that like Kai was sharing, I think there's a lot of people here for whom that was super new, who didn't know that this was this cross-border international operation, but it truly is. And I think that because we know that Petraeus and Brewer are having these conversations, I think if they are expanding their depth of conversations as a movement, we need to as well. And I think this is an indication that we are. That's why also myself and a few others and numerous other peoples in this room are part of this network called Abolish KKR, to bring in a whole bunch of people who are involved in so many different ways. There are researchers, there are lawyers, there are a lot of nonprofits, and of course, folks on the ground who are dealing with this every day, who are part of this network. And the importance of that is to say, okay, we all have these different strengths. We all have these different access points to how we can make change. How can we make sure we're all working together? Because we know that on the flip side, there is this playbook. There are these peoples in positions of power who are working together. We need to do the same. We need to respond in the same way to make sure our movements are strong and they're building, and that we are getting out the stories of what is happening on the ground, because we are combating this giant structure that is equipped with guns and military ammunition and this exorbitant budget. And in the face of that, that can be so disempowering to know that. But that's why we need to face those, or need to reckon with the fact that we have different types of weapons of peace, weapons of unity, weapons of hope. And like, I don't want to say that in like a floofy hippie way, but like in a real, like, okay, movements have fought off projects and movements have defended their lands and their territories. And that's why we're here. And so creating those connections is so important. I think what also is so important is that we are in this vast, complicated nation state of Canada, and we have this legal platform that exists to divide communities and to make it complicated and challenging to address these issues. And it's so easy to get caught in this world of playing whack-a-mole, of just this project, that project, this community is being impacted, that community is being impacted. And what can taking out some of the structures that are repressing all of those look like? And that's why I think looking at KKR and looking at this giant structure that they've manufactured to repress multiple movements, what does it look like if we take that away and really work to abolish that and disband that, so that those movements that are vibrant and are creating connections and are creating networks, what does it look like when they can thrive without that state repression? And so looking at all the different pieces that are impacting folks on the ground, I think can hopefully set the stage for really addressing something like KKR. Because I know that even outside of the province, people are asking, okay, well, if we don't say anything in BC, then what stops Canada from expanding the KKR? And so that's why this network has become way beyond BC borders, is because they know that if we, or I say we, but I am in BC, if those outside of BC don't stand in solidarity with what's happening here, then what hope do we have to really fight these projects once they just spread, especially if there is already a playbook and they're practicing here on the ground? I don't know if I have anything to tie that all in a little bow, but if you do want to talk more about disbanding KKR, I think there's a lot of people here who'd love to talk about it. I'd love to talk about it with you. But I'm going to pass it on to wherever we're passing it.
As I was listening and watching the crowd here, I want people to know that are watching the importance of doing exactly and remembering the stories. I want to thank Slato. A month ago, I had this opportunity to go to England, and then I went to Switzerland. Because I want to tell the story because you cannot think that things are too overwhelming. The biggest barrier we'll ever have is the ones that we create. One of the biggest barriers is fear. Well, there is no fear. There should be never be fear when you tell the truth. I went to England, and I wore my regalia, and I walked down to Buckingham Palace to address the new king. And it just so happened to be the day after they celebrated his birthday. And I reminded him, and it was a video message to him, that when he was a prince, he said that he would stand up for the environment. When he was a prince, that he stood up for human rights. He's a king now. Act like it and keep your word. Then I went off to Switzerland. I had a meeting. Well, first I had a rally with Greta Thunberg. I just love her. And then we had a meeting with BIS. So BIS is a Bank of International Settlement. So what they do is they direct and advise 65 central banks. Now those 65 central banks control 95% of the world's GDP. So don't think that things are overwhelming or too big and we can't do it. Hell, if I could do it, so can you. And you know what? It does make a difference. I am so proud that everywhere I went, in all the huge meetings that I did, and once again, thank you, Slato, for that opportunity, they knew who the Gitxsan and Wet'suwet'en were. That's pretty goddamn impressive. And they stand with us. And you need to keep that messaging. This is worldwide because they know we're doing something for climate change, for humanity. And I'm going to close with one thing and give you a mission. Do you know that Canada is vying again for the United Nations Human Rights Council? And I think we should work hard to make sure Canada doesn't get that seat because we did it once before. Why on earth would Canada have a seat on the United Nations Human Rights Council when your human rights aren't being respected? Masai Kyo.